The realtor's name was Keith Alderman, and he was showing my apartment on a Tuesday afternoon in April when I walked through the door. I know it was Tuesday because I had rearranged a client meeting to drive from Raleigh to Durham specifically for this. And I know it was April because the dogwoods on my street were at their peak, that specific window of 2 weeks when the entire neighborhood looks like it was designed for a photograph, and then returns to being an ordinary neighborhood again. Keith Alderman was standing in my living room with a couple in their early 30s, the man with a measuring tape extended toward the south wall, the woman with her phone raised to photograph the view from the window that looks out at the courtyard I had specifically chosen when I bought the unit 4 years ago. Keith had a listing packet in his hand. The listing packet had a price on the cover, $289,000. The apartment was listed at $289,000. My apartment, the apartment that I had purchased at 26 with my own down payment and my own mortgage and my own name on the deed, the apartment in which all of my furniture was currently arranged as a staging display I had not authorized, the apartment that my parents, Gail and Roy Mercer, had listed for sale with Keith Alderman's agency in order to fund the $100,000 wedding of my sister Tatum, who was getting married in June to a man named Preston Worth, and who had at some point between January and April allowed my parents to believe that the proceeds from selling my apartment were a resource available to the family. I was 29 years old. I was standing in my own living room looking at a realtor, 2 prospective buyers, a measuring tape against my south wall, and a listing price of $289,000. I had driven 2 hours from Raleigh. I had the deed in my bag. Before I take you back to the beginning, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if this story genuinely stays with you. Drop your city and the time in the comments. I always love knowing where you're watching from. My name is Nora Mercer. I'm 29 years old. I am a title examiner and real estate paralegal at a property law firm in Raleigh, North Carolina, which means I spend my professional life doing the specific work of understanding who owns what, reading chain of title, identifying encumbrances, resolving the disputes that arise when the documentation of ownership does not match the lived understanding of it. I am very good at this work. I mention it because it is the reason I understood when my neighbor May called me on a Monday morning in April and said there was a real estate lockbox on my door and a for sale sign in the building's front garden, exactly what had happened and exactly what it would take to address it. I did not panic. I pulled the listing from the public records portal I use for work. I identified Keith Alderman's agency. I found the listing date, which was April 6th. I pulled the deed of trust from the Register of Deeds, confirmed my name as the sole owner, confirmed no recorded transfer or power of attorney that would authorize anyone else to act on my behalf, and I called my firm's supervising attorney, a woman named Harriet Cole, who has been practicing real estate law in North Carolina for 26 years and who listened to everything I told her, and then said, "Go get your apartment back." I drove to Durham on Tuesday. I arrived during the showing. This is the story of how that was possible and what had to happen for it to become impossible to continue. Let me take you back to Greensboro, North Carolina, my parents' house on Waverly Road, where I grew up in the specific and comfortable household of a family that ran on the logic of Gail Mercer's planning and Roy Mercer's paycheck. My father had been a regional manager at an insurance company for 22 years. My mother had been, in various capacities, the person who organized everything: the household, the social calendar, the presentation of a family that looked the way she believed a family should look. She was talented at this, in the way that people are talented at things they have committed their organizational intelligence to for decades. What she organized impeccably was the surface. What she organized less carefully was the accounting underneath the surface, the specific arithmetic of who in the family had received what, and what those receipts implied about who was owed what, and what resources belonged to whom. Tatum was 3 years older than me, 32, a marketing coordinator at a company in Durham who had met Preston Worth at a work conference in Asheville and had been engaged since November. Preston was a financial analyst. He was pleasant in the way of men who have never been required to be more than pleasant because pleasantness has always been sufficient. The wedding was set for June 14th at a venue in the Eno River area of Durham that Tatum had chosen in December, and that required, for the full version of the day she was planning, a budget that the combined resources of Tatum and Preston and Gail and Roy could not cover without supplementing from somewhere. The somewhere had been identified, apparently, in January, in a conversation between Gail and Roy that I had not been part of, and that had produced a plan I had not been consulted on. The plan, as I would reconstruct it from the evidence, was as follows. My apartment in Durham had been purchased 4 years earlier, when I was 25, using $38,000 in savings I had accumulated across 3 years of working, supplemented by a loan from my paternal grandfather, Howard Mercer, who had given me $15,000 as an early inheritance gift specifically designated for the purpose of buying property. Howard had been precise about the designation. The gift letter he signed with his attorney had said for the purchase of real property by Nora Beth Mercer specifically, not for general family use, not for any other purpose. I had the gift letter. It was in the same folder as the deed. The apartment had appreciated in the 4 years since purchase. The current listing price of $289,000 represented approximately $87,000 in equity over my outstanding mortgage. $87,000 toward a wedding budget of $100,000 was the arithmetic that had apparently been done in January by my parents in the specific and unexamined way that parents sometimes do arithmetic with resources they have decided belong to the family regardless of whose name the documents are in. My parents had, in the 4 years since I bought the apartment, maintained a belief that was partly my fault to correct and partly a result of the specific dynamics of my family. The belief that the apartment was something I held temporarily, a starting point rather than an established asset, the thing that the practical daughter owned before the real life began. Tatum's real life had begun. The engagement, the venue, the June date, the $100,000 budget. My real life, in the accounting of Gail and Roy Mercer, was the thing that would begin once Tatum's had been properly launched. The apartment was the practical daughter's practical asset, and practical assets, in the family's operational logic, were resources to be allocated where the family most needed them. The family most needed them in June on the Eno River. My mother had called Roy's real estate agent, a man he had used for investment property transactions, and had described the apartment as a family property that she and Roy wanted to list. Keith Alderman had taken the listing in good faith. He had not run a title search before taking the listing, which is not unusual for an agent expecting a straightforward transaction, and which is, in this specific case, the thing that would have told him immediately that the property did not belong to the people listing it. He had taken the listing. He had put the lockbox on the door, my door, with a key code I had not authorized, and had posted the listing and had scheduled showings for the week of April 9th. My neighbor May had seen the lockbox on Monday. I had arrived on Tuesday. Keith Alderman's face, when I walked through the door during the Tuesday showing, was the face of a man processing information that does not fit the framework he has been operating inside. He was a professional. He recovered quickly. He stepped toward me with the courteous neutrality of someone managing an unexpected variable in a showing and said he was sorry. He didn't realize the current resident would be here. He had understood the unit was vacant. I told him the unit was not vacant because I lived in it. I told him I was the owner of record. I put the deed on the kitchen counter, which was my kitchen counter, which had my coffee maker on it, and I said his listing was unauthorized and would need to be withdrawn by the end of the business day. The couple with the measuring tape lowered the measuring tape. The woman with the phone lowered the phone. Keith looked at the deed, which he could not refute because it said what it said, and the seal of the Durham County Register of Deeds was on it, and my name was the only name on it. Keith called my parents from my living room while I stood there, which was the professional thing to do. He needed to understand from his clients what had happened, and I was not going to pretend I wasn't present for that call. I heard the call from Keith's side. I heard him explain that the owner of record was present and that the listing was not authorized. I heard him say that there was a woman named Nora Mercer on the property claiming ownership. I heard the pause that followed. Then I heard Keith say that he understood and that he would be in touch. He ended the call. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has just understood that his client described the property with significant inaccuracy. He said he would withdraw the listing by end of day. He said he was sorry for the disruption. He gathered his packet and ushered the couple out and left, and for the first time in 4 years, I was standing in my apartment that was not for sale and had never been for sale and would not be for sale. I sat down on my couch, and I called Harriet Cole. Harriet had prepared for this call. She told me Keith's withdrawal of the listing was the first step, but that the listing itself, the public record fact of it, which could be seen by anyone who searched the Durham real estate database, needed to be documented as unauthorized, and that I should consider whether to involve law enforcement or pursue it through a civil attorney's letter to my parents, formally notifying them that any future attempt to list or encumber the property without my authorization would be treated as attempted fraud. She said she would draft the letter that afternoon. She said, "Nora, call your parents before the letter arrives. The letter should not be their first notification from you." She said it the way she said things she had learned from 26 years of practice, simply as the correct sequence. I sat with my phone for a long time before I called. Here is the question I want to ask you before I tell you what that call was like, because I have turned it over many times, and I do not have a single answer to it. If you discovered that your parents had listed your home for sale without your knowledge to fund your siblings' wedding, would you call them yourself first? Or would you let the legal letter be the communication? Some people hear this and say call immediately, confront it directly, make them hear your voice. Some people hear it and say let the letter arrive, let the professionals frame it. Protect yourself from the emotion of the direct call. Tell me in the comments which one you would choose and why. Because the call I made that afternoon was the hardest single phone call I have made in my adult life. And I have wondered many times whether sending the letter first would have been less hard or simply differently hard. My mother answered on the second ring. I had expected voicemail. The answering told me she had been waiting for the call, had known from Keith Alderman's communication that I was in Durham, that I knew that the call was coming. Her voice, when she answered, had the quality of a woman who had been rehearsing a response and was now discovering that the rehearsal had not prepared her for the actual phone. I said, "Mom, Keith Alderman called you from my apartment." Not a question, a statement of the starting point. She said she could explain. I said she should go ahead and explain. What followed was 22 minutes that I have played back many times, and that I want to describe with the accuracy it deserves rather than the editorial that emotion would introduce. My mother said she and Roy had been overwhelmed by the wedding costs and had made a decision that she knew was premature, and that she had planned to talk to me about before anything moved forward. She said the listing had happened faster than she expected. Keith had moved more quickly than she had anticipated, and she had been planning to have the conversation with me that week. She said she understood the apartment was in my name, but that the family had contributed to it, and she had thought of it as a family asset. I said the family had not contributed to it. Howard's gift had been specifically designated for my purchase and had not come from my parents. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said Howard's gift had always been understood as family money. I said Howard's gift letter said specifically that it was not family money, and that the Register of Deeds contained no document that described it as anything other than my sole property. Another silence. Then, Nora, Tatum's wedding, I said. Mom, you listed my home for sale without my knowledge or consent. I need you to understand what I'm saying. You listed my home. Roy called 4 minutes after I ended the call with my mother. His call was shorter and had the specific quality of my father's communications when he had been informed by my mother that something had gone wrong and was now being asked to address it. Roy said he wanted to talk through the situation. He said they had gotten ahead of themselves and should have come to me first. He said they were prepared to make it right. I asked what making it right meant to him. He said they would pull the listing. It was already being pulled, he understood, and they would find another way to address the wedding budget. I said pulling a listing that should never have been filed did not constitute making it right, and that Harriet Cole's letter would be arriving in the next 24 hours explaining the legal dimensions of what had occurred, and that I needed him to read it before we had any further conversation about what making it right looked like. He was quiet. He said okay. He said he was sorry. He said it in the way he said things he was sorry about, briefly, factually, without elaboration, which was its own kind of honesty. Harriet's letter arrived on Wednesday. It was 4 pages and was the specific kind of document that Harriet produced when she wanted a situation to be understood precisely, thorough, documented, without aggression, but without the softening that leaves ambiguity. It identified the unauthorized listing. It documented the chain of title establishing my sole ownership. It referenced Howard's gift letter and its specific designation. It stated formally that any future attempt to list, encumber, transfer, or otherwise act upon the property without my written authorization would be referred to the Durham County District Attorney's Office and the North Carolina Real Estate Commission for investigation. It was not a threat. It was a description of what the law required. The law required nothing additional from Harriet. The law was simply the law, and the law said my name on the deed. Tatum called on Thursday. Her call was the call I had been dreading most, not because Tatum was the villain of this situation. She was not. She had not listed the apartment. She had not been in my living room with a measuring tape, but because Tatum's wedding was the fact around which everything else had organized itself, and the conversation with Tatum required me to say things that were true about the wedding without making the wedding itself the target of my anger, which was a distinction I was not certain I could maintain cleanly while I was still 4 days from the Tuesday in the apartment. Tatum said she had not known. She said it with the specific quality of someone who is telling the truth, but understands that the truth is also an incomplete picture. She had not known about the listing. She had known about the budget problem. She had known that her parents were trying to find a solution. She had not asked what the solution was, which was the incompleteness in her not knowing, and which she acknowledged when I waited long enough for her to acknowledge it herself. She said, I didn't ask. She said, I should have asked. She said she was sorry. I told her I received the sorry and that I needed her to understand that the sorry was for the not asking and not for what my parents had done, because those were separate accountabilities, even if they were connected. She said she understood. Tatum asked what this meant for the wedding. I said the wedding was not my problem to solve and that I was not in a position to solve it even if it were, because the calculation that had made the apartment seem like a solution was based on a misunderstanding of what the apartment was, and correcting misunderstandings is not the same as funding weddings. She said she understood that. She said Preston had been talking about scaling back the venue and the budget to something they could manage without family contributions. She said it with the specific quality of a woman who has been thinking about a thing for several days and has arrived at a conclusion she had been resisting. She said, it was always too much. The $100,000. It was always more than made sense. She said Preston had said so in December, and she had not wanted to hear it, and she was hearing it now. I told her I was glad she was hearing it. I meant it. Let me tell you what happened with the wedding, and with my parents, and with Howard's gift letter, and with the apartment that is still mine. The wedding happened on June 14th, which was the date Tatum had set in November, but it happened differently. The Eno River venue was replaced with a park pavilion that Preston's family had used for 3 generations of family events, and that cost a permit and a catering fee, and the specific goodwill of a family that had been attending events there since Preston's grandparents were married in 1962. 100 guests became 60. The $100,000 budget became $22,000, which Tatum and Preston paid themselves over 4 months. It was by Tatum's account when she called me the week after, the day she had actually wanted, the version of the day that was theirs, that fit what they had and who they were, that didn't require anyone to compromise an asset they hadn't offered. She said it was the best decision she had made in the wedding planning process, which had contained several decisions she had made under the pressure of an idea about what the day should look like rather than what it actually needed to be. I attended the wedding. I want to say this directly because the question of whether I would attend was a question I sat with for several weeks, and the answer was not automatic. I attended because Tatum's wedding was Tatum's wedding, and my relationship with Tatum was not my relationship with my parents, and the capacity to hold those as different things was something I had worked on since April and had reached a sufficient version of by June. I sat in the 3rd row of the pavilion seating on a warm June afternoon, and I watched my sister marry a man who had insisted on a budget that made sense and who had been right about it since December. And the watching had in it the uncomplicated warmth I actually felt for Tatum and the complicated feeling I actually felt about the past several months. And the two things coexisted because they were both true, and because that is how feelings work when you stop trying to resolve them into a single version. My parents were at the wedding. We spoke briefly, the specific brevity of people who are managing a significant conversation across the constraint of a wedding day, which is not the right occasion for the significant conversation, and both parties know it. My mother hugged me. I allowed it. My father shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than a handshake requires, which was his available vocabulary for something he did not have other words for. The significant conversation was scheduled for the following Saturday, specifically scheduled by me in advance because I was done with conversations that arrived without preparation, and I was not going to allow the next one to be anything other than deliberate. The Saturday conversation was at my parents' house in Greensboro, not my apartment. I had no interest in conducting a conversation about my apartment inside my apartment. Their house, their table, their responsibility to sit with what they had done in the specific context of the life they had built the doing inside. Harriet had suggested I bring a trusted witness. I brought my grandfather Howard, who was 78 years old and who drove himself from Guilford County to Greensboro on a Saturday morning and sat beside me at the table his son had eaten at for 25 years and who said almost nothing during the 2-hour conversation, but whose presence communicated, in the specific and undeniable way of the person whose money had been implicated in the decision, that the decision had been seen and assessed by someone who had a stake in its assessment. My mother cried. My father did not cry, but sat with the expression of a man who is doing the specific work of accounting, not financial accounting, but the human kind, the kind where you go back through the decisions and trace each one to the moment it was made and the logic that produced it, and then hold the logic against the outcome and acknowledge the gap. The accounting took most of the 2 hours. I did not rush it. I had time. I had prepared for this conversation in the way I prepared for complex title examinations, completely with all relevant documents, with a clear understanding of what outcome I was seeking and what the path to that outcome required from each party. What I was seeking was not an apology. I had the apologies from April, from the phone calls, from the brevity at the wedding. What I was seeking was acknowledgement of the specific thing, Not the general acknowledgement that a mistake had been made, which was available and which my parents had offered multiple times, but the specific acknowledgement that the apartment was mine and had always been mine, and that the calculation that had made it seem available had been a calculation about my resources made without my participation, and that the calculation revealed something about how my parents had been thinking about me that needed to be named and understood rather than smoothed over. The naming took most of the 2 hours. My mother got there. She said at the end of the conversation that she had been thinking of me as the daughter who could handle things, who didn't need the same care as Tatum, who would understand, who would be practical about it, and that she had used that thinking to justify a decision that had nothing to do with what I could handle and everything to do with what she needed in that moment. She said it precisely. It was the most specific sentence she had said to me in my adult life. I received it as what it was. Howard said one thing during the 2 hours. He waited until my mother had finished her precise sentence, and then he said, the gift letter was specific, for a reason. The reason was exactly this. He said it to my father. He said it calmly, in the voice of a 78-year-old man who has spent his life being precise about documents, and who does not need to be louder than the fact to make the fact available. My father looked at his father, and nodded once, the specific nod of a man receiving something from the person whose opinion matters most to him, in the form of the truth. Let me tell you where everyone is now. The apartment is mine. The listing was withdrawn on Tuesday, April 9th. Harriet filed a protective notation with the Durham County Register of Deeds documenting the unauthorized listing and confirming the sole ownership, which is a procedural step that functions as a permanent record that the property's ownership was challenged without merit. The notation will appear in any future title search of the property. It will be the first thing any future title examiner sees. I am a title examiner. I filed the notation myself. My parents and I are in the specific place that follows a significant conversation that produced the naming that was needed. Not a healed place, not a repaired place, but a more accurate place. My mother calls on Sundays. The calls are different from the calls before April. They are shorter in some ways and more direct in others. She does not manage around the things that are uncomfortable. She acknowledges the April events when the conversation approaches them, rather than steering away. It is not reconciliation in the sense of a restored relationship. It is the beginning of a different relationship from the one we had, which was a relationship organized around my manageability rather than my presence. The different relationship is slower and more honest and requires more from both of us, which is the correct trade. My father and I have not yet had the one-on-one conversation that the Saturday table did not fully provide. It is coming. He has asked for it, which itself is something. My father asking for a conversation rather than waiting for it to be organized around him is not the previous behavior pattern, and the departure from the previous behavior pattern is worth noting. The conversation will happen when I am ready for it, which I am not yet. I know what I need from it, and I am assembling the clarity to ask for it directly, which is the work I am currently doing and which I am doing at my own pace. Tatum calls on Fridays. The calls are the calls of sisters who have found an honesty with each other that the previous version of our relationship did not contain, because the previous version had been organized around a family architecture that assigned roles without examining them, and the April events had reorganized the architecture enough that the roles were visible, and the visibility was the beginning of renegotiation. Tatum told me in July that the pavilion wedding had been written up in a local lifestyle blog, a piece about meaningful small weddings, and that she had received more compliments about the day from guests than she would have imagined from a $100,000 event. She said, Preston was right in December. She said it with the specific quality of a woman acknowledging something it had cost her something to acknowledge, which was the most honest I had heard Tatum be about herself in 32 years of knowing her. Howard calls on Wednesdays. He has been calling on Wednesdays since I bought the apartment because he said when someone has given you their money for a specific purpose, they should be able to check in on how the specific purpose is going. The apartment is going well. The equity has continued to appreciate. Howard asks about the neighborhood and the HOA and the roof assessment that was coming up and whether I had reviewed the reserve fund study. He asks like a man who takes his investment seriously, which is what he is. I give him accurate answers, which is what he deserves. Here is what I want to say before I go. There is a specific kind of entitlement that does not announce itself as entitlement because it has been named as something else: practicality, family thinking, making things work, the reasonable allocation of available resources. In my family, I was the available resource. Not because anyone had decided to exploit me, because the accounting had been done without my participation, and the accounting had produced a number that seemed available, and the seeming available was enough to generate an action that the law and the deed and the gift letter described as unauthorized. The entitlement was quiet. It was organized. It wore the clothes of problem solving. It showed up in my apartment with a lockbox on the door and a listing price of $289,000 and a couple with a measuring tape against my south wall. I had the deed. I had always had the deed. What the April events required of me was not acquiring the deed, but using it, presenting it in the specific context where its authority needed to be established, which was the living room of my own apartment during a showing I had not authorized. The deed said what it said. The Register of Deeds said what it said. Harriet Cole's letter said what it said. These documents did not require me to argue or to defend or to produce the emotional evidence of my claim. They required only that they be present. Documents, when they are correct, do not need assistance beyond being accurately read. If you are the one in your family who is described as practical, the one who handles things, who doesn't need as much, who will understand, who can manage, I want you to hear this with the specific attention it requires. Practical is not the same as available. Your capacity to handle things is not consent to have things done to your property without your knowledge. Your manageability is not a resource that the family can allocate. You are not the load-bearing wall that everyone builds against without asking whether the wall wants to hold that weight. Get the deed. Whatever form the deed takes in your life, the document, the letter, the record, the professional notation that goes in the permanent file. Get it. Keep it. Know what it says. And when someone puts a lockbox on your door, without your knowledge, drive to Durham on a Tuesday in April with the deed in your bag, and walk through the door during the showing and put it on the kitchen counter. The dogwoods will be at their peak. It will be the exact right moment. My name is Nora Mercer. I am 29 years old. My parents listed my apartment for sale to fund my sister's $100,000 wedding without telling me. My neighbor May saw the lockbox. I drove from Raleigh. I walked through my door during the Tuesday showing. I put the deed on the kitchen counter. Keith Alderman withdrew the listing by end of business. Harriet Cole filed the notation with the Register of Deeds. Howard called on Wednesday. The apartment is mine. The dogwoods were at their peak. Thank you for staying until the very end. If someone has ever treated something that was specifically yours as a resource that belonged to everyone, a deed, a gift, a careful accumulation, drop a comment. Tell me what document you put on the kitchen counter. I read every single one. If this story found you in a moment where something that is yours is being treated as available, share it with the person who needs to hear that the deed says what it says, and that the Register of Deeds is open to the public, and that Tuesday in April is exactly the right time to drive to Durham. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.